How do you write a D&D campaign? Well, with this one simple trick, I have taken over 8 D&D campaigns to level 20 over many years. What's more, this technique allows me to never run out of story and plot, so the campaign always feels like a cohesive experience. Additionally, whether you're running a sandbox or a more narrative-heavy campaign, this trick will help you write your next D&D story. This is the first in a series of videos that will teach you how to write a D&D campaign from scratch. If you want more content like this, make sure to like this video and comment down below. Writing a D&D campaign isn't like writing a book or a movie script. The players control and shape the story just as much as the Dungeon Master. However, that doesn't mean that Dungeon Masters still cannot plan out their narratives and story beats. Dungeon Masters, planning a story is not railroading your players. Taking away agency and choice from them is. If planning a story is railroading, then Wizards of the Coast is encouraging it with their pre-made adventures. Dungeon Masters, you don't have unlimited time and resources. 9 out of 10 players actually want you to plan some type of story, and I've been seeing too many Dungeon Masters who just improv everything, and their players and campaigns are suffering for it. They come to me and they ask, how can I fix my campaign? What am I doing wrong? And I ask, well, what's your planning? And they don't have an overarching story to hold everything together. They don't have a plan for the future, and that is how campaigns die. So how do we write these dynamic stories? Well, you use the 3-arc structure. This is the 3-arc structure for a campaign. We'll start small and go big. Before I even tell you about any of these arcs, let me tell you how this system works. Most of you won't watch until the end of this video, but I'm going to at least put the most important information here. Always be advancing at least one arc in a session. Usually it will be your immediate arc. However, if in a session you realize that the party isn't making progress on your immediate arc, you can always change gears and advance the narrative arc or the campaign arc. Always be switching between the arcs and keep moving forward. As long as you're always advancing one arc in a significant way, each session your campaigns will feel well run and thought out. My players sometimes believe I have everything mapped out. The truth is, I do not. However, using the 3-arc structure, I can pace the adventure well enough so that it feels like it slides from one moment to the next. Like everything was pre-planned, when in reality, their actions are affecting the overarching story, and I'm constantly adjusting to make sure that they have agency. But in order to bounce between these arcs seamlessly, you have to know what each arc is and what they're supposed to do. We'll start with the immediate arc. An immediate arc is the problem your party is dealing with over a session, maybe 2. Finding an NPC, clearing out a dungeon, or solving a mystery are all great examples of an immediate arc. This arc you can plan with the greatest amount of detail, since you can be pretty sure what your party will be up to. However, the immediate arc is also the thing that you have to be most okay with just chucking out. Strict adherence to your immediate arc is what makes players feel railroaded. You can definitely railroad players with these other arcs, but usually it's the immediate arc that is the culprit that makes a D&D party feel railroaded. Basically, be flexible with this arc. Perhaps you plan for your players to talk to an NPC, heck, the entire session revolves around it, but they don't. Don't panic, see what your party does and roll with it. Again, if they don't want to do your immediate arc, don't force them. This builds resentment. You'll eventually gather tools to help shepherd them onto the right path, but if you're a new Dungeon Master, just let it go. An immediate arc's time limit should be at most 3 sessions. By constantly completing immediate arcs, your party should feel like they are making some progress in your campaign. But you cannot build a campaign off of immediate arcs alone, else it becomes a slog. That's the problem with Mega Dungeon adventures. They are constant immediate arcs with nothing over them, and eventually that gets boring. This is why we have things like narrative arcs. The narrative arc is what truly separates good and bad campaigns in my experience. Think of a narrative arc akin to a season in your favorite TV show. These arcs span 5 or 6 times longer than your immediate arc. I usually make sure my narrative arcs are at least 10 sessions. Narrative arcs, wait for it, build the overall narrative of your campaign. They make sure all those small, immediate arcs are building to something. Let's use Infinity War as an example. Thanos collecting each Infinity Stone is an immediate arc for his character, but the narrative arc is centered around Thanos completing the Infinity Gauntlet. The narrative arc ends in the movie when Thanos completes the gauntlet, and the next narrative arc starts when he snapped. But this narrative arc could have ended in so many ways. Thanos could have been stopped, he could have realized the error of his ways, or maybe an Avenger completes the gauntlet and uses it for their own power. You don't really know how your narrative arc is going to end, but it is important to make sure that they do have a definitive ending that affects the story. Powerful narrative arcs are important for keeping your group's attention. Another great reason for narrative arcs is that they make sure that the campaign doesn't bog down into a slog. If a party is facing a singular goal for the entire campaign and making a little progress at a time, many players will just lose interest. In order to get to level 20, your campaign is going to go for months if not years. Making sure your story continues to feel fresh and interesting is important, and not just for campaigns that want to go to level 20, for any campaign, whether you're going to 5, 10, whatever number. You want your story to consistently be surprising and changing. Narrative arcs are also a great way to use player backstory. At least for me, the overarching story is more or less pre-written. Sure, I use player backstory to adjust my vision of the overarching story, but at its core, it's kind of pre-written. However, I use their backstory a great deal in narrative arcs. Narrative arc antagonists are usually drawn directly from player backstories in my campaigns. Players love it because they get to interact with their backstories, and as a DM, I have to do far less work. But what do these arcs look like? Well, at least for my arcs, I try to keep them vague. Usually I try to write the arcs with a clear initiating event though. A dragon attack, the king is kidnapped, or the party learns a devastating secret. It's very important, despite the vagueness of the rest of the arc, to have a clear initiating event so we know when the arc begins. Then I flesh out the arc's antagonist. Let's use an example of, let's say, an evil wizard who summoned an army of the undead. The summoning is the initiating event. It's very clear. The party knows exactly when the arc starts, when that undead army rises up. Now they know they have entered the narrative arc. By the way, this is really important. Your party should know what their objective is, especially in a narrative campaign. Unclear objectives kill motivation and creativity. It's hard for players to get creative when they don't know what the problem is that they're trying to solve. Even in sandboxes, this advice works well. In a sandbox, the party chooses what to do at any given time. However, if they're given a quest, the party should know exactly what their goal is. Well, they should at least think they know exactly what their goal is. You can always throw in a twist every now and then to keep things interesting. So, for our example, the party must defeat the evil wizard and destroy the undead army. What's next? Well, I usually build out the villain and their motivations. Who is this antagonist and what do they want? Maybe they could be friendly to the party given the right circumstances. Maybe the villain doesn't know the consequences of their actions and would stop if they just knew a bit more information. And my favorite, the villain that is actually a hero. Their motivations at first seem sinister, but the party over the arc comes to realize that another person or force is what they actually must stop. Use this technique sparingly. It can be annoying if used too often. After our antagonist is built, we then turn to possible solutions to the problem. I build at least 1 or 2, but usually 3 solutions. Then I plant these solutions in the world to be given out by NPCs or found in places like letters, books, dungeons, you name it. It's important to plant these solutions so that your party at least has some way to make progress. When you write these solutions, they should be vague, but when the party actually goes to follow these steps, usually they'll take the form of immediate arcs. However, remember that these are not the only solutions. If your party thinks of another way of solving this problem, let them go for it. As a dungeon master, if this happens, the question you should be asking yourself is not, how do I stop them? But instead, how do I make this an equivalent challenge? D&D gets boring if a solution allows you to walk through a villain's plans too easily, so it is your job, in my opinion, to intercept the party's solution in an interesting way. Example, maybe our evil wizard's undead army can be destroyed by holy water, so the party wants to use their cleric to bless a river and lead the army into it, thus destroying them. Dang, you didn't think of that. It sounds so easy. But how can we twist this? Remember, improv is all about yes and. Don't forget the and. Perhaps to bless the entire river, the party needs an artifact of the cleric's god. Now it's a race against time to get the artifact. Or maybe that much divine energy centered in one place attracts dangerous creatures. Now the party has to defend themselves as they're waiting for the undead army to arrive. These are just quick examples that are pretty bad, but the general theory is the same. Take your party solution and make it a challenge. You are the dungeon master. You control the world, and it's not a regular world. It's a story world. Your world exists to run a fun game inside, so make sure your world is fun. After you've made your vague solutions, and if you have time, this is what I do to really improve the stories in my campaigns. I think up some badass situations that could happen in this narrative arc. then I write them out, fantasizing about what would be cool, what would my players love, like what things can really make it cinematic and epic. Then I just keep those moments in my back pocket and try to weave them into my arc. If the moment happens, great, I've set up a memorable and impactful moment. And if it never happens, then that's okay too. But you grow as a dungeon master, and you'll get better at shepherding your players towards these moments, or better at adjusting to what your players do and throwing in these moments naturally. And once again, shepherding is different from railroading. If your players don't want to do something, don't force them or take their agency away. Let the game happen. As a dungeon master, I throw out 40 to 50% of my planning for an average session. However, sometimes I throw out 10%, and sometimes I throw out 90%. But it is better to have planned something than nothing at all. All the best dungeon masters I know take their time planning their sessions and are also willing to use none of that planning. The last thing to do when constructing a narrative arc is to add a bridge to the next narrative arc at the end. Always give your arc another stepping stone. Maybe after defeating your evil wizard, you learn that they were actually a servant of Orcus, and the wizard's defeat leads you to the secret order who is trying to summon the demon lord, and the wizard was just a high-ranking cog in this massive machine. Using this technique, you will never have to have your party floundering between arcs. There will always be something else for them to do if they choose. Finally, the campaign arc. This is the longest arc that spans the entire campaign. If you want to run a campaign to level 20, I'd argue that this is almost a requirement to have a campaign arc. The campaign arc is the thesis of your campaign. Usually the threat is built around a concept. The god of law has gone missing, the devils are losing the blood war, or the return of an elder evil are all great ideas for a campaign arc. Campaign arc doesn't need to present itself fully early on. Sometimes it's enough to hint towards the campaign arc, but the players should know that something's happening in the background and that they can look forward to it. However, I would argue that it is best for your players to know about it by the end of your first narrative arc. Your campaign arc or arcs should be extremely vague and fluid. Remember, this is a concept. It should adapt to the needs of your party and yourself. If the concept doesn't interest you anymore, adjust it. I believe it is imperative for a dungeon master to always be excited by their own campaign arc. If you're not, it's gotta change, else that apathy will bleed into your campaign overall and your players. Usually, you advance your campaign arc at the end of a narrative arc. At least, that's how I do it. By doing this, you link everything in your campaign together and makes it feel unified in its experience. When all the narratives blend together, the campaign becomes more understandable for the players and gains momentum. Players feel like your campaign is building to something, and that is a great feeling. And you know what? It makes sense. In all other media, we expect a 3-act structure. D&D doesn't provide that experience. However, we can still take the momentum present in a 3-act structure and add it into our games. Building energy draws players into your campaign. Additionally, campaign arcs help a dungeon master set form and tone for their campaign. Take Curse of Strahd. The campaign arc is escaping Barovia. Everything builds to that eventual end. And knowing the campaign arc adds a lot to the setting and the tone. The mists become a character. The feeling of hopelessness always looms, and the knowledge of an eventual encounter with Strahd certainly affects the tone of the game, at least in my opinion. Without that arc being present, I would argue that many campaigns, not just Curse of Strahd, would lose what makes them special. From Strahd to Tomb of Annihilation, Storm King's Thunder, Waterdeep Dragon Heist, you name it, all of them are made special because of their campaign arc. Additionally, I think of player and NPC character arcs in terms of a campaign arc. Obviously, players have control over what their character does and how they change, but it is up to you as the DM to introduce things to them and control that pacing. When I read a player's backstory, I look for things that the player wants from the campaign. Then I list those things out and I keep track of them. If a character has amnesia, for instance, eventually they're gonna want to learn what they forgot. That's something that the trope insists upon. Thus, it is up to me as a good dungeon master to feel out when and how the trope needs to be executed so that the player can have a good experience, the experience that they were hoping for when they wrote that backstory or made that character choice. By mapping potential moments out on a campaign arc, you can tell if you're neglecting characters or maybe advancing a character too quickly. If a player or NPC goes through all their development halfway through the campaign, then the interest in them begins to die. Ideally, you should be ending campaign arcs for players and NPCs in the final session or the second to last session. At the very least for NPCs, ending their arc in the last narrative arc in the campaign. Also, if you're a particularly bloodthirsty DM, it gives you the ability to kill off NPCs with their story having already been told. They've reached their story's apex and can go without it being too traumatic for your players. Kind of a side tip, but this structure works well if you have an idea for how long you want your campaign to last. To some, it may seem controversial, but I think having a time limit on a campaign improves its quality. I think that the worst thing that can happen with a campaign is that you stay with it too long, past the point where the players are finding it fun. If you know how many sessions generally you want to run, that helps you focus on the story, the narrative, everything else. Now, I don't mean this as a hard number. Let's say you declare that you want to run a campaign for 80 sessions. I usually think that there's a 20% grace margin, so if a campaign runs 70 or 90 sessions, no one's going to mind. However, if the campaign goes 100 or 110 sessions, the campaign might be bloated. Now, this number doesn't mean anything if you're having a great time with your friends, but it should be something to keep in mind. And what's more, even if your players are having a good time, they still might want to change campaigns. I know it sounds crazy to new Dungeon Masters, but think about this. Most players only play in 1, maybe 2 D&D games. As a Dungeon Master, you have so much variety and choice, yet a player is stuck with one character. They might love your campaign, but they just want to try something new. People change. Your players aren't the same people they were 6 months ago when you started your campaign. Their tastes and interests might have changed. I think that's another reason why settling on a general session length is a good idea. It gives some players solace because they know when they'll be able to play their next character. Any player can ride out 10 more sessions to finish a campaign that they love, but if the number is unknown and it feels like the campaign might just keep on going for months, people might bail. The 3 arc structure has served me very well. Immediate arcs are great for keeping each session fun and fresh, and you can throw them out if you need to. Narrative arcs keep campaigns moving and are great ways to involve backstory. They are the adventures within your campaign, and their conclusions will be the stories that players tell for years. Finally, the campaign arcs are the things that tie everything together. They are vague but important for shaping the form and tone of your campaign. An important part of keeping a campaign going, though, is combat. If you TPK, then all your story planning and efforts won't matter much. So check out these 2 videos if you're looking to improve your combats. Also, thank you for entering the dungeon.